Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. This is sponsored by the ATS section of medical education. My name is Yuri Matusov. I'm an assistant professor at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. I'm the section of medical education webinar chair for this year. I will be moderating today's discussion entitled How to Get a MedEd Grant. And we've planned a wonderful discussion about the ins and outs of applying for grants in medical education. Our discussants have been involved or in either applying or reviewing MedEd grants, and they're a wealth of knowledge and information, so we're going to have a great talk. The session will be recorded and posted on the ATS website. We'll address questions from the audience at the end of the webinar, so please post your questions in the chat. And with that, I will let our discussants introduce themselves.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Morgan Soffler. I am currently practicing at New York Medical College, Westchester Medical Center in New York, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I've been involved with the section of medical education through ATS for a number of years, and I'm not sure I would call myself an expert on writing grants. I have some grant writing experience and have been lucky enough to receive some grant funding. But I'll tell you, as I'm sure we'll discuss today, I also have a lot of experience not getting grant funding that I applied for, and sometimes those experiences are even more valuable. And I would say most of my knowledge in grant applications has really come from my role as a planning chair for the section of medical education. I served in that role for 3 years. And had the opportunity to review lots of grants along with a lot of nationally renowned medical educators within our field, and really learned a lot from them at how they were thinking about these grants and their worthiness of funding. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks so much for having me.
Perfect. I can go next. I'm Diana Kelm. I am from Mayo Clinic Rochester. I'm one of our PCCM APDs and the medical director of our SIM Center. I have, just like Morgan, have a lot of experiences not getting grants, but also been thankfully successful in getting predominantly a lot of internal grants at my institution. There's a lot of opportunities that I've been able to take advantage of, and then have had some success with external grants. But I review a lot of grants, both in the SIM-based research and more general med-ed research. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and sharing what I've experienced and learning from you as well.
And I'm Kashika Goyal. I'm an assistant professor at Ohio State and a very new faculty member, and new, I think, to the realm of medical education and grant writing. Similarly, have a bit of a mixed record, but was able to be the lucky recipient of the ATS Medical Education Grant this past year, so have some experience in grant writing, and very happy to share my experience as someone who is very new to this kind of arena and what that transition into that looked like.
Great, thank you all. So I think just to begin the discussion, I'd like to start asking, maybe Kashi can start talking about sort of your experiences of looking for grants. Where did you look? Why did you want to apply for one? And then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, so I think I work in a group with 2 other faculty members in kind of this collaborative sense, and we had started some foray into our research project just on a local scale, so within our own institution, and then really wanted to think about how we could scale our medical education progress and project. We specifically have been looking at how we can increase access and equity to the PCCM fellowship and really working to create a pipeline. So I think for us, it started as an idea, and we actually held a local event for our medical school and wanted both the support and some funding to really make this a longitudinal project. So that, I think, was the nidus for us looking for grants. And then I think for us, having really great mentors and sponsorship was important in that some of my mentors kind of pointed me in the direction of the ATS MedEd grant and thought it would be a good place to start, which is what prompted us to apply for that. I think it was helpful to have a little bit of work that we had already done in terms of preliminary results, and some, aims that we had already formed, and it really just flowed nicely into that application process. I think we were also looking for a sweet spot in terms of the size of the grant and the funding to really match the scale of the project that we are doing. So I think that's another important point to consider.
Great. And maybe I can ask Morgan and Diana, so apart from the ATS grant, what are sort of other potential sources of funding that people can apply for?
Yeah, so the ATS section of MedEd grant is great. That's a wonderful opportunity. APCCMPD, so the Association of Pulmonary Critical Care Medicine Program Directors, has a grant as well. That calls actually, I think, early November. So there's still that opportunity. Often CHEST will have something combined with APCCMPD. They actually have it was a Diversity Scholar Fellowship Award that you could apply for. And then AAMC has a lot of opportunities. Encourage you to look there. And then institutionally, I know not every institution is going to have internal opportunities, but that is definitely something to explore and see if there is even just some small grants within your division or at a larger capacity. But I would encourage you to look institutionally as well. It's a good place to start. Morgan, I don't know if you may have some others to add.
Yeah, my list is pretty similar to Diana's. I know I took a crack at a AAMC GEA award. And those I think that's for me the one that sticks out the most, like outside of our specialty per se. But definitely the ATS section of medical education grant, APCC MPD, and then I believe CHEST, I agree, also has some available. And I'll say that I came from an institution where there was a big culture of medical education and a center for medical education. And so it was like in my face obvious that there was some grant funding opportunity there. But even at kind of the institution that I'm at now, where there's, it's a little bit less in your face, there's no center for education, I've actually been able to find some sources of funding there as well. So just to piggyback off of Diana's comment, those are often the easiest, I think, grants to get if you're really looking for kind of that, if your motivation is really monetary support.
Yeah. Kasha, did you look at sort of other places as well when you before you applied for the ATS grant?
Yeah, we did. So I think similarly to Morgan, the institution I'm at has a pretty big center for medical education. And so there were some innovation awards that we considered, but felt like the scope was maybe just a little bit too large. And then our group did apply for the APCC MPD one, but we're not successful in our attempts there. But yeah, I would echo those are kind of the same avenues that we had looked at. And I think kind of highlights that it certainly takes more than one attempt to be successful in this process.
Yeah. I want to highlight that, Kashi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you applied for this when you were still a fellow. Is that right?
I was doing. Oh, yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask if you could share your experience of sort of, going through fellowship, but also applying for this and how you sort of viewed that as your long-term career track.
Yeah, so I was doing my advanced fellowship in lung transplant, so I had a little bit more time, I think, to kind of suss out what I wanted my career breakdown to look like. And like I mentioned, had been working on this project, in the year prior, so it made sense to just try to formalize it. And then I think the trick in MedEd that I'm finding is finding really tangible ways to be scholarly with the work that I'm doing in medical education. And so felt like looking for grant funding and going through the process of even just grant writing would ultimately make me, I think, a more fine-tuned scholar in this area.
One of the things that comes up very frequently, a lot of people have sort of education as part of their job in academic medical centers, even if that's not the primary part of their job. But maybe can I ask Morgan or Diana to comment on, what kind of educational things should you be looking for to try to apply for a grant? So what kind of medical educational activities are often considered, and what have you seen be successful in terms of applying for MedEd grants?
Yeah, that's a great question, Yuri. And I would say that if I could backstep off that question a little bit to answer it more effectively, I think there's different domains that you can think about, what qualifies as education. And so, for example, curriculum development, I think lots of people, to the point of your question, are, like may have educational roles and develop novel curricula. And like, is that publishable? Does that like could that get some sort of funding? And I think the answer is maybe. It depends a little bit on some of the categories that I think lots of grants are judged upon. So like one would be innovation. So if this is um, a completely novel curriculum that addresses some major gap in medical education or, PCCM education, like, yeah, like that even though like curricular development may be sort of, like, considered a little bit, I don't say like low, but, the outcomes of which like may be a little bit harder to study. I would say if it's something really innovative, yes, curriculum development, may be in there. And I think one of the cycles when I was reviewing grant applications, a grant that was looking at a curriculum development for financial education for fellows was funded, for example. Like that was considered to be a major gap. But other domains to think about would be things like, is this project generalizable? So it's something that we could all benefit from in the educational like realm. So if you're doing something that you think really could help a lot of different programs, or a big educational gap in general, like definitely. And then, there's sort of the like innovations category. Like, are you just doing something like that sounds really, really cool and nobody else has tried before? That might be, that might be something to highlight, or do you have some sort of really interesting outcome? Like you did some sort of innovation or you had some sort of curriculum and the outcome was really interesting and is something that you feel would be like reportable. So I think it's helpful to think about, if you're involved in education, like how to make it scholarly, or is this scholarly, or is this worth me putting in the effort to write a grant? Has a lot to do with like how you answer those questions. Like, is this innovative? Is this generalizable? Can I, is the outcomes of this really interesting? Does it fill some sort of really important gap?
Yeah, I think I would add that it does depend on the grant and its competitiveness. So if you're applying for like a large grant, like APCCMPD or the section of MedEd, even, you need to be thinking about the generalizability. A single site study may not be as attractive versus a multi-site to allow that generalizability, as well as the outcomes that you're looking at. If you're just looking at a pre and post confidence or satisfaction, that would be great for maybe a small institutional grant that you're building kind of your pre-work to submit for a larger grant. So some of that depends on which grant that you're going for. But I do think it's important. A lot of us do curriculum development and we need the academic currency as publications and grants and things like that. And so how can you think about your curriculum early rather than after the fact to make it into a scholarly project and apply for grants is important too. So I would encourage people to start thinking early about it.
No, that's great. Thank you. So I guess going off of that question, one question that I might have is, how much work do you need to have done before applying for a grant? Obviously, this probably varies between grants, but on average, among the things that you've reviewed or Kashi, you applied for, what kind of work, sort of preliminary work, needs to have been done?
I think it depends a lot on the type of, it depends a lot upon the grant that you're applying for. So some grants may prioritize actually like someone who's, like starting out in medical education and be more geared towards junior faculty. I would say that it's probably true of the majority of grants that I have applied for. Larger grants may like they want to know that their money is they want to know the money is going to good use, and so they may look for some sort of track record or at least have some sort of a mentor or somebody on the project that's helping to oversee that project with a track record. So again, it depends a bit upon the grant, but I say regardless, it probably makes sense to have at least somebody on your proposal have experience in actually getting grant funding or having success with various projects.
I would add that really look at the RFA like backwards and forwards, because I think it can be time consuming because every grant tends to have slightly different formats. And so I think that can be really time consuming, is to make sure that you're hitting all of the check boxes for each grant. Because I've done this before, submitting a similar project or same project to multiple grants. it sounds like Kashi, you did that as well with your study. So, finding the right home for your study, but every grant slightly has different formats. So really looking at the RFA. And I would suggest, when I was brand new to this, I had no idea what an NIH BioSketch was, but you should probably make one. You're going to need one for all these big grants. And so it's good to make one. And then you can just edit it as you go through your career. If you haven't seen them before, it's kind of, there's one part that's kind of a personal statement of why you should be really good for the grant. That part I edit every single time, depending on the grant, because there's certain things that the grant reviewers are going to look for. So you want to make sure you put that in that part. And then obviously, if you start getting more publications, you add that. But I would recommend doing that early, because that is definitely something most bigger grants are going to require. And I found that very time consuming, especially for my first time.
Yeah, I felt similarly. I think I didn't necessarily appreciate all the nuances of grant writing and some of the stylistic things that can be a part of it. One thing I found very helpful is that one of my collaborators, has written NIH grants and does translational research as well. And so I think finding, people to work with who have different backgrounds, it was profoundly helpful to have someone who is familiar with language or NIH biosketches or things to have templates for. And I think in terms of the prior research, again, I think it probably just varies depending on the size of the grant, but having some work done, I think, again, and having very clear aims, like, Morgan alluded to, does make the grant writing process a lot easier than trying to kind of start from scratch with that big grant.
Yeah. No, I think I want to highlight something that was said, which is that, this is not a sort of necessarily a solo project, right? Is that you should have other people involved in this. And ideally people, I think Morgan mentioned this, ideally people who've had some experience, in the particular area that you're applying, if possible. And, maybe those people don't necessarily have to be within your institution, especially if you're at an institution that doesn't have the framework that's set up for that sort of thing. Would you all agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yes.
And there are lots of, speaking like specifically within ATS, just, having been part of like that committee too, to try to promote some of these applications, like the point of this is to really like acknowledge, at least for the ATS medical education grant, is to really like acknowledge people and give them some support who want to do work in this area. And like they're looking for good proposals. So you can even ask, for example, like, through ATS, like there are people that would be more than happy to like talk about your project and make suggestions. If you don't have somebody who you feel like you could necessarily lean on for mentorship at your own institution. And I bet that that's probably true for APCC, MPD, and CHESS, that there are, medical education leaders or people who have some experience with grant writing that would be happy to listen to your idea, take a look at your proposal if it otherwise isn't a conflict for them, and help you out. It's a pretty tight-knit, I think, community, medical educators within our field, and people who are interested in research. And so there's help to go around for sure.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
I was just going to highlight, I think, something that Kashi said. It is nice, even, yes, medical educators for sure bring a nice perspective, but even having someone that is not maybe in medical education, but does a lot of research just gives a really nice perspective that maybe we didn't think about. So I think having that fresh set of eyes, someone that does research with a kind of in a different area, but could bring some nice perspective to your project could be really nice as well. So I think that's the teamwork, I think, is key, in getting the right people to help you is important to be successful.
Great, thank you. One question I have sort of, say I'm working at a place where, we don't have sort of necessarily a great infrastructure for medical education grant applications, and I'd like to apply for one. What sort of, on average, these vary between grants, obviously, but what sort of requirements of me would the grant often have? So, for example, do they require that I have a set amount of time dedicated to education, right? Do they have a set amount of, for example, do I have to have a specific academic appointment somewhere? Could you comment on any of those things?
I think it really depends upon the grant, honestly. And, I think Diana mentioned this earlier, but really paying attention to that RFA, to the call for for funding, and reading it carefully. I'll say that a lot of the proposals that that we sometimes get for like the ATS medical education grant, some of those proposals like didn't fit the bill. Like it was clear, like people didn't really necessarily pay attention to exactly what people, what the committee was looking for. And so just read that carefully, and all the information you need about like, eligibility should be in that. And if not, there should be a contact information, I'm sure, for somebody who should be able to answer that question for you.
Yeah, at least the ones that I have seen don't have like you need a certain requirement in education or things like that. Some of the ones, at least internally, trainees couldn't apply for. So again, just looking at that RFA and making sure you meet that criteria. But I haven't seen anything regarding specific education time or I think especially if it's early career kind of grants, you shouldn't be like associate professor and things like that. So kind of your ranking and in your academic rank might matter in some of that. So that's another thing to take a look at when you're looking at the various grants.
Thank you. So I asked a little bit earlier about sort of what makes some grant applications successful. I guess let me turn that around a little bit. So what are some of the things that that make it less successful? So what are sort of things to avoid, or, if you don't mind talking about it, some of your, some of the feedback that you've gotten on grants that have been unsuccessful?
I think, for the last, so I've had a couple that we've applied for, and one was a curriculum. And so some of the feedback that we've gotten is that when you're thinking about what specific outcome you're going to study, making sure that, especially in a curricular space, that they're really finite and tangible, and that there are things you can track longitudinally. So that I think can be difficult to capture. So we got that feedback. And then the scope of the project, just either being too large or too small for the grant. And so when we think about fit, that's one of the, feedbacks I've also gotten in the past. And then sometimes it's, I think, more generic, that it's just been a really competitive cycle, and it just kind of wasn't our year.
Yeah, to build on what Kashi said, from the grant review committee for ATS, that comes up quite a bit, the scope not being quite the right fit. And usually it's like too big a scope, I would say. So it's like, can this project actually get done within 2 years, which is like what the grant application is for. So that's probably like the number one thing that comes up on that committee. The second popular bit of feedback that comes up in that committee is, what is the money actually going to be used for? And so being very specific about how that money is going to be used. Are you doing focus groups? Do you need to purchase recorders or software to help with qualitative data analysis? Do you have to hire somebody to help you with your data analysis? Do you need that money to go to a conference or to publish, et cetera? So that's really important, to be very specific about what you need that money for, not just like, I'd love to like say I got money for this project.
I think some of the things I've seen, especially as a reviewer of education grants, is that, their study aims, they have really great study aims, but study aim number 2 depends on study aim number 1. And what if that study aim number 1 fails? That kind of, it makes it hard to know what to do with that information to support a grant if there's a lot of dependency on your other study aims. So I think that's something to be mindful of. And if that's the case, just making it clear that there's plans that, if this doesn't work, this is what we're thinking, just making it clear in the actual writing of the grant that you've thought through that. The more thoughtful you can show the reviewers that you've thought through the timeline, the feasibility, the scope, all that, the easier it is to approve, I think, as well. So I would just be really try to your best to be clear that you thought through all of the different processes. And I think another thing is, as kind of mentioned, like AI is a big topic. And so if you're submitting a grant for AI stuff, how are you going to create that AI thing? Do you know how to do that? Or are you going to hire someone to do that? You're going to use that money to hire a computer programmer. That's just one example, but making sure that like you have the expertise either in your study team. Because I reviewed several that they were doing some AI stuff, but there was nobody on the team that was part of AI or knew AI. So I was like, well, how are you going to do this? And so I think that's the question, is if the reviewers are saying, well, how is this going to work? that's not a good sign. I think you need to make it clear in your proposal.
Great, thank you. So before I open it up to questions, any sort of final words from the three of you regarding this process, or words of advice?
My big piece of advice would be to put yourself out there and go for it. That more than anything we'll say, probably the actual feedback you get on your ideas and your projects you're gonna learn more from that, and then you'll reapply. And I think we've all done that and put out multiple different proposals, and it's worth the time and the effort, even if you don't necessarily get the grant funding. It really can make your project better.
I think I was going to say something similar. That I think it's always worth a shot, and I think really the iterations and the feedback, the project ends up being better. So hopefully, when you do get that grant, it's really because you've kind of honed in on this really excellent project.
Yeah, I agree. Medical education research is not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. It's definitely takes a lot of work, and so don't give up. Persist. And if a door closes, look for another one. So there's a lot of opportunities. So I echo what you guys have said. And then I really do think it's important to build a team, and that team ideally should include people outside of your bubble. And so that seek out help, use this community, the section on medical education, APCCMPD, et cetera, to find your people to help you and to guide you, and that'll help you be more successful.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll open it up to questions. If you're able to unmute yourself, you can do that. Otherwise, you can also just type them in the chat, and I'll read them out loud. Well, I want to thank you all. This has been a fantastic seminar. I really appreciate your time. I thank you to the section of medical education for sponsoring this webinar. And this is the first webinar of a series on MedEd scholarship that we're going to have over the course of this year. So, I encourage you to log on to the subsequent ones. We'll get alerts coming out.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll conclude with that. Everyone, have a great night.